billionaire CEO pretended to be asleep on a pile of cash to test his poor black maid, but what she did shocked her. In a Manhattan penthouse worth more than some countries' national budgets, a billionaire CEO pretended to be asleep on $250,000 in cash, just to test the integrity of his poor black maid. He expected greed. He expected betrayal. He expected to prove, once again, that no one in this world could be trusted. But what Amara did next shattered everything he believed about human nature. Before we begin, please kindly subscribe to this channel, like, comment, and share this story so it can reach hearts across the world. The pre-dawn darkness of Manhattan carried a peculiar stillness that morning, the kind that made even the most hardened city dwellers pause. In the penthouse suite of the Ashford Tower, the most exclusive residential building overlooking Central Park, that silence was about to be broken by an act that would change 2 lives forever. Marcus Ashford III stood before his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the first hints of sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. At 42, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America, having built Ashford Global Industries from a single tech startup into a multinational empire worth over $8 billion. His face had graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time. He'd been called a visionary, a genius, a ruthless businessman who could smell opportunity from miles away. But none of those accolades filled the hollow space that had grown inside him over the past 5 years. Marcus turned from the window and surveyed his domain. The penthouse sprawled across 12,000 square feet of marble floors, custom Italian furniture, and art pieces worth more than most people's homes. A Picasso hung casually in the hallway. A Monet graced the dining room. Sculptures by contemporary masters dotted the space like expensive chess pieces in a game only the ultra-wealthy could play. It was magnificent. It was pristine. It was utterly empty of anything that mattered. His wife, Veronica, had left 3 years ago, taking their daughter Emma with her. The divorce had been vicious and public, splashed across tabloids that delighted in watching the mighty fall. Veronica had accused him of being married to his work, of prioritizing profit over people, of building an empire while neglecting his family. The worst part was that she'd been right. Since then, Marcus had cycled through 17 housekeepers. Each one had started with enthusiasm and ended with either resignation or termination. They stole small items, thinking he wouldn't notice. They gossiped to tabloids about his private life. They brought friends into his home when he was away. They saw him not as a human being but as a walking ATM, an opportunity to be exploited. It had made him cynical, bitter, suspicious of every kindness, every smile, every gesture of goodwill. Everyone has a price, his father had told him when Marcus was just a boy growing up in Connecticut, watching his own father build the family's modest fortune. Everyone wants something. The key to success is figuring out what that something is before they can use it against you. Marcus had built his empire on that philosophy. He could read people, predict their moves, manipulate their desires. It had made him rich beyond imagination. It had also made him profoundly alone. Which is why, on this particular Thursday morning in November, Marcus had decided to conduct an experiment. A test. One final attempt to answer the question that had been gnawing at him for years. Was there anyone in this world who would do the right thing when no one was watching? When there was no reward, no recognition, no advantage to be gained. He'd hired his newest housekeeper 3 months ago. Her name was Amara Johnson, a 34-year-old woman from the Bronx who'd responded to his employment agency's posting. Her resume had been modest: high school diploma, 10 years of housekeeping experience, impeccable references from middle-class families who'd employed her. Nothing that suggested she was different from all the others. But something about her had caught his attention during the interview. She'd sat in his study, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a simple blue dress that had been carefully pressed but showed signs of age around the collar. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her face devoid of makeup except for a touch of lip balm. She'd answered his questions directly, without embellishment or flattery. "Why do you want this position?" he'd asked, studying her over steepled fingers. "I need the salary, Mr. Ashford," she'd replied honestly. My mother has diabetes and needs medication that her insurance doesn't fully cover. My younger brother is trying to get through community college. The pay you're offering would allow me to help them while still saving for my own future." "Most people would dress that up more prettily," he'd observed. "Make it sound less transactional." "Most people would be lying to you then," she'd said, meeting his eyes. "You asked why I want the job. I told you the truth. I need the money. But that doesn't mean I won't do excellent work. I take pride in what I do, Mr. Ashford. I may be cleaning houses, but I do it with integrity and attention to detail. The families I've worked for, you can call them. They'll tell you." He had called them. Every single reference had praised Amara's work ethic, her honesty, her quiet competence. One elderly woman had actually cried on the phone, saying she'd only lost Amara's services because she'd moved to assisted living. "She treated me like family," the woman had said. "Never once made me feel like an obligation. That girl has a heart of gold." Marcus had hired her, but with reservations. Hearts of gold, in his experience, were usually just iron pyrite, fool's gold that glittered until you looked closely enough to see the base metal underneath. For 3 months, Amara had worked in his home 5 days a week, arriving at 6 a.m. and leaving at 2 p.m. She cleaned with meticulous care, never moved his personal items without asking, prepared simple meals when requested, and maintained a professional distance that he appreciated. She didn't pry into his life, didn't gossip on the phone while working, didn't invite friends over or post selfies from his penthouse on social media. She was, on the surface, exactly what he'd hoped to find. But Marcus had learned not to trust surfaces. Which brought him to this morning's test. The previous evening, Marcus had withdrawn $250,000 in cash from his bank, a mixture of hundreds, 50s, and 20s. He'd spent an hour arranging the bills in messy stacks across his study floor, creating the impression of someone who'd been counting money and fallen asleep in the middle of the task. Then he'd positioned himself carefully on the leather couch in the study, lying on his side with bills scattered around him, some tucked under his arm, others spilling from his relaxed fingers onto the floor. The setup was perfect. From the doorway, it would look exactly like what he wanted Amara to think. That he'd been drinking, he'd left an empty whiskey glass on the side table, counting cash for some reason, and passed out in the middle of it all. And now, at 5:47 a.m., Marcus lay perfectly still on that couch, his breathing slow and measured, his eyes closed just enough to appear deeply asleep while still allowing him to see through his lashes. Hidden cameras he'd installed the day before were positioned to capture every angle of the room. He'd paid a security specialist $50,000 to install them discreetly. Tiny, nearly invisible devices that would record everything in 4K clarity. The cash surrounded him like a paper fortress. $250,000. More money than Amara would likely see in 5 years of working for him. Enough to solve all her problems, her mother's medical bills, her brother's education, her own dreams of a better future. All she had to do was take it. Marcus knew the statistics. He'd researched them obsessively. Studies showed that approximately 40% of employees admitted to stealing from their employers at some point. The numbers were likely higher when you factored in those who wouldn't admit it. When large sums of cash were involved, when the risk of being caught seemed low, when the need was great enough, people took what wasn't theirs. It was human nature. It was survival instinct. It was, his father would have said, just being realistic about the world. Part of Marcus hoped Amara would take the money. It would confirm everything he believed about human nature, about the futility of trust, about the fundamental selfishness that lurked beneath every kind gesture and every warm smile. It would justify his cynicism, validate his isolation, excuse his inability to form genuine connections. But there was another part of him, smaller, more vulnerable, the part he'd buried under layers of business acumen and defensive walls, that desperately hoped she wouldn't. That hoped, against all his experience and evidence, that there was still goodness in the world. That someone could look at a fortune and walk away from it. That integrity could survive in the face of temptation. The click of a key in the penthouse door echoed through the silence. Marcus's heart rate increased slightly, though his breathing remained steady and deep. Through the crack of his eyelids, he could see the study door, currently ajar about 6 inches. From his position on the couch, he had a direct line of sight to anyone who might enter. He heard Amara's footsteps in the entrance hall, the soft sound of her practical sneakers on marble floor. She always arrived exactly at 6 a.m., never a minute late, never trying to leave early. He heard the familiar sounds of her hanging up her coat, setting down her bag in the small closet designated for household staff. Then silence. Marcus imagined her standing in a hallway, perhaps noticing that something was different this morning. Usually, he was either still asleep in his bedroom or already awake and in his home gym, following the rigid schedule that governed his life. The lights being on in the study at this hour would be unusual. Would she investigate? Would she assume he'd simply forgotten to turn them off? Would she walk past, focusing on her usual routine of starting in the kitchen and working her way through the public spaces? The footsteps came closer. Marcus forced his body to remain relaxed, fought against the instinct to tense up. He was supposed to be passed out drunk, completely unaware of his surroundings. He let his mouth fall open slightly, added a soft, barely perceptible snore. The study door opened wider. Through his lashes, Marcus saw Amara's figure appear in the doorway. She froze, her hand still on the doorknob, taking in the scene before her. Even from this distance, Marcus could see her eyes widen. Could see her take an involuntary step back. Could see her free hand come up to cover her mouth in shock. She stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, processing what she was seeing. Her employer apparently passed out drunk on the couch, surrounded by more cash than most people would see in a lifetime. Marcus waited. This was the moment. This was when she would reveal her true nature. Would she rush forward, wake him up, express concern for his well-being? Would she discreetly leave the room and pretend she'd seen nothing, maintaining her professional distance? Would she stand there, frozen by indecision? Or would she see opportunity in his vulnerability? Amara took a slow step into the room. Then another. Marcus's pulse thundered in his ears, but he kept his breathing steady, his body loose and relaxed. Through the narrow slits of his vision, he watched her approach. She stopped about 5 feet from the couch, staring down at him and the money surrounding him. Her expression was impossible to read. Shock, certainly, but what else? Concern? Calculation? Temptation? This was it. This was the moment that would answer all his questions about human nature, about trust, about whether anyone in this world could resist the allure of easy money when no one was watching. Amara stood perfectly still, her eyes moving from his face to the cash and back again. And then, slowly, she began to move. Amara Johnson's hand trembled slightly as she stood frozen in the doorway of Marcus Ashford's study. In all her 34 years, through all the hardships and struggles that had defined her life, she had never seen this much cash in one place. Hundreds of bills, maybe thousands, scattered across the floor like autumn leaves, stacked on the coffee table, even tucked under her employer's arm as he lay unconscious on the leather couch. Her first thought wasn't about the money. It was about Marcus. "Mr. Ashford," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, are you okay?" No response. Just the soft, rhythmic sound of his breathing, punctuated by the occasional snore. Amara's professional instincts warred with her concern. In the 3 months she'd worked here, Marcus Ashford had been nothing but professional, if distant. He rarely spoke to her beyond basic instructions or polite greetings. He worked constantly, often from home, his phone perpetually attached to his ear as he conducted business in multiple languages, barking orders that sent stock prices soaring or plummeting. She knew he was wealthy, obviously. You didn't live in a penthouse like this without extraordinary means. But she'd never seen him like this, vulnerable, disheveled, surrounded by cash like some kind of drug dealer from a bad movie. Had something happened? Was he in danger? Was this some kind of ransom situation? Her mind raced through possibilities as she took another cautious step forward. The smell of whiskey hung in the air, emanating from the empty glass on the side table. Drunk, then. Not in danger, just intoxicated. But that seemed wrong somehow. In 3 months, she'd never seen Marcus drink more than a single glass of wine with dinner. He was disciplined, almost rigidly so. This kind of excess seemed completely out of character. "Mr. Ashford," she tried again, a bit louder this time. "Sir, I'm going to make sure you're all right." She moved closer, careful not to step on any of the bills scattered across the floor. Up close, she could see his chest rising and falling steadily. His color was good, not the pale shade of someone in medical distress. Just deeply asleep, or passed out. Amara had seen enough drunk people in her life to recognize the signs. Her father, before he died when she was 15, had struggled with alcohol. She remembered nights like this, finding him passed out in their small apartment, having to clean up the mess, make sure he was breathing, position him so he wouldn't choke if he got sick. The memory stung, sharp and immediate after all these years. She knelt beside the couch, close enough now to see the individual bills tucked under Marcus's arm. Hundreds. So many hundreds. And 50s. And 20s. A fortune just lying here, unprotected, unguarded. Amara reached out slowly, her hand hovering over Marcus's shoulder. Should she wake him? Help him to his bedroom? What was the professional protocol when you found your billionaire employer passed out drunk on a pile of cash? Her fingers were inches from his shoulder when she stopped. What if he'd done this on purpose? What if this was some kind of test? The thought hit her like ice water. Amara pulled her hand back, her heart suddenly pounding. She'd heard stories from other housekeepers, other domestic workers in Manhattan. Rich people did things like this sometimes. Set up scenarios to test their employees' honesty. Left money lying around to see if it would disappear. Pretended to be asleep or out of the house to catch staff in compromising positions. Was that what this was? Some elaborate scheme to see if she would steal from him? Amara sat back on her heels, studying Marcus's face. He looked genuinely asleep, but she'd learned long ago that looking was different from being. People wore masks, played roles, hid their true intentions behind carefully constructed facades. She thought about the past 3 months. Marcus had been a good employer, demanding but fair, never rude, always paid her on time with a generous Christmas bonus that had made her cry in the bathroom. But he was also guarded, watchful. She'd often felt his eyes on her as she worked, as if he was constantly evaluating, measuring, judging. Maybe this was the final evaluation. Amara stood up slowly, backing away from the couch, and the temptation spread before her. $250,000. She had no idea of the exact amount, but she could estimate. More money than she'd ever imagine having. Enough to pay off her mother's medical bills in full. Enough to send her brother Jerome through 4 years of college without him having to work 3 part-time jobs. Enough to finally move out of the cramped 1-bedroom apartment she shared with her mother, where she slept on a pull-out couch in the living room. Enough to change everything. Her hand moved unconsciously toward a stack of hundreds on the coffee table. Just one bill. Just $5,000. Mr. Ashford wouldn't miss it, wouldn't even notice it was gone from this massive pile. And it would mean so much to her family. Her mother, Grace, needed a new insulin pump. The one she had was 10 years old, malfunctioning, requiring constant monitoring that kept Grace up half the night and Amara worried all day. A new one cost $7,000 with their insurance. Just 2 bills from this pile, and her mother could sleep peacefully again, could manage her diabetes without the constant fear of her equipment failing. Jerome was brilliant, had always been the smartest kid in school, the one who helped other students with their homework, who dreamed of becoming an engineer. But community college was all they could afford, and even that was a stretch. He was taking just 2 classes per semester, working at a grocery store, at a fast food restaurant, at a tutoring center, trying to cobble together enough money for tuition. At this rate, it would take him 8 years to get his associate's degree, longer for a bachelor's. His dreams were being ground down by the reality of poverty, day by day, hour by hour. $5,000. 10,000. 20. How much would be enough? How much would be too much? How much could she take before it became obvious, before the cameras caught her, before the test revealed her failure? Because of course there were cameras. There had to be. A man like Marcus Ashford didn't leave $250,000 lying around without insurance, without protection, without eyes watching from every angle. Amara's hand froze 6 inches from the stack of bills. She could see her reflection in the glass of the coffee table, a tired woman in a worn blue dress, hair pulled back because she couldn't afford a decent haircut, eyes shadowed from too many nights lying awake worrying about bills, about her family, about a future that seemed to recede further with every passing year. She looked poor because she was poor. She looked desperate because she was desperate. But she wasn't a thief. The realization crashed over her with absolute clarity. No matter how much she needed the money, no matter how much it could help her family, no matter how unfair it was that this man had so much while she had so little, it wasn't hers. And taking it would make her something she'd vowed never to become. When Amara was 7 years old, her father had taken her to the corner store. She'd seen a candy bar and slipped it into her pocket while he wasn't looking. On the walk home, he'd ask her if she had something to tell him. She'd pulled out the candy bar, confused about how he'd known. "I saw you reflected in the store window," he'd said quietly. "And right now, I want you to make a choice, baby girl. You can keep that candy bar. Eat it, enjoy it. But every time you taste the chocolate, you'll know it's stolen. You'll know you took something that wasn't yours. Or you can walk back to that store right now, apologize to Mr. Kim, and return it. That'll taste bitter going down, but sweet for the rest of your life." She'd walked back, apologized, returned the candy bar. Mr. Kim had accepted her apology with grace, and her father had bought her a candy bar with his own money on the way out. "That's the difference," he told her, his hand warm in hers as they walk home. "Between what you take and what you earn. One makes you smaller. The other makes you who you are." Her father had made a lot of mistakes, had struggled with demons that eventually consumed him. But he'd taught her that one lesson, and it had stuck with her through everything that came after. Amara pulled her hand back completely, clasping both hands together as if to physically prevent herself from reaching for the money again. She looked down at Marcus, still apparently dead to the world, oblivious to her internal struggle. Was he testing her? Probably. Was it fair? Absolutely not. Did she resent being put in this position, having her integrity evaluated like some kind of lab experiment? Yes, she did. Deeply. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was who she chose to be in this moment, when no one else was watching, when she could take what she desperately needed and probably get away with it. And she chose to be her father's daughter. She chose integrity. Amara made her decision. Moving carefully, she picked up a clean throw blanket from the chair by the window. She approached the couch and gently draped it over Marcus, making sure not to disturb him. The money was still everywhere, still tempting, still whispering promises of an easier life. She ignored it. Instead, she began to gather the bills carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. She stacked them neatly on the coffee table, organizing them by denomination. Hundreds together, 50s together, 20s together. It took 15 minutes of careful work, and with each bill she touched, she felt the weight of temptation press down on her. But she didn't take a single one. When all the money was neatly stacked on the table, Amara stepped back and surveyed her work. Marcus remained asleep, or pretending to sleep, his face peaceful under the blanket she'd covered him with. "Sir," she said quietly, knowing he probably couldn't hear her, "I don't know if you're testing me or if you really are just drunk and careless with your money. Either way, it's not mine to take. My mama raised me better than that." She turned toward the door, then paused. There was a notepad on Marcus's desk, the kind he used for jotting down quick reminders. Amara walked over, picked up a pen, and wrote in her neat, careful handwriting. "Mr. Ashford, found you asleep in your study at 6:05 a.m. Organized the cash and covered you with a blanket. There is $247,000 here. I counted it to make sure nothing was missing from what I could see. If you need anything when you wake up, I'll be cleaning the east wing. Amara. She placed the note prominently on top of the stacked bills where he couldn't miss it, then quietly left the study, closing the door softly behind her. As she walked toward the kitchen to begin her regular duties, Amara felt tears prick her eyes. Not tears of regret, she'd made the right choice, she knew that, but tears of exhaustion. Tears of frustration at a world where some people had so much that they could afford to test others, while those others had so little that the test was torture. She thought about her mother, probably awake right now at their apartment, checking her blood sugar, rationing her insulin strips because they were expensive. She thought about Jerome, who'd be heading to his first job in an hour, already tired before his day had begun. She could have helped them. All that money, right there, unguarded. She could have changed everything. But she'd chosen something else instead. Something harder. Something that wouldn't pay the bills or fix the insulin pump or send Jerome to college, but something that let her look at herself in the mirror without shame. In the study, Marcus remained perfectly still, his heart pounding beneath the blanket Amara had placed over him. Behind his closed eyes, tears stung, tears he hadn't expected, hadn't prepared for, tears that came from a place he'd thought was long dead inside him. She hadn't taken anything. Not a single bill. More than that, she'd protected him, covered him with a blanket, organized his money, even counted it to ensure its safety. She'd treated him not as an opportunity to exploit, but as a human being who needed care. When had anyone last done that? When had anyone last looked at him and seen not his wealth, not his power, not what he could do for them, but simply a person who needed help? Marcus waited until he heard Amara's footsteps retreat down the hall, heard the sound of her beginning her work in the kitchen, the quiet clatter of dishes, the rush of water in the sink. Only then did he slowly sit up, careful not to disturb the careful stacks of money on the table. He picked up the note she'd left, reading it once, then twice, then a third time. $247,000. She'd actually counted it. Every single bill. His hand shook slightly as he set the note back down. In his 42 years, Marcus had conducted thousands of business deals, negotiated with world leaders, faced down hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. He'd been in high-stakes situations that would have broken lesser men. But nothing had prepared him for the emotions flooding through him now. Relief. Shame. Hope. Gratitude. And underneath it all, a crushing awareness of his own cynicism, his own broken faith in humanity, his own willingness to see the worst in everyone around him. Amara had passed his test. More than passed it, she'd shattered his expectations, his assumptions, his carefully constructed worldview. And now Marcus had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. He stood up slowly, folding the blanket she'd placed over him with a care that surprised him. His hands moved over the soft fabric, and he found himself wondering when she'd bought it, how much it had cost, whether she'd chosen it specifically for its warmth and softness. Small kindnesses. That's what she'd shown him. The blanket. The note. The careful organization of his money. These weren't dramatic gestures or grand heroic acts. They were simple, human kindnesses extended to someone who'd done nothing to earn them. Marcus walked to his desk and activated his computer, pulling up the security footage from the hidden cameras. He watched the entire scene again, Amara's shock upon entering, her concern for his well-being, her visible internal struggle as she looked at the money. He saw the moment her hand reached toward the bills, saw it hover there, saw her pull it back. He watched her face as she made her decision, as she chose integrity over opportunity. There was pain in her expression, real pain, the kind that came from sacrifice. This hadn't been easy for her. This hadn't been a casual choice or a simple matter of following rules. This had cost her something. And she'd paid that cost anyway. Marcus saved the footage, backed it up to 3 separate secure servers. This wasn't just evidence anymore. This was something precious, proof that goodness existed, that trust was possible, that somewhere in this cynical, mercenary world, there were still people who would do the right thing simply because it was right. He sat at his desk for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of Amara working in the other room, going about her duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. As if she hadn't just performed a small miracle of character. Marcus opened his laptop and began to type, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. He had calls to make, arrangements to prepare, plans to set in motion. If Amara Johnson had proven herself to be exceptional, then she deserved to be treated exceptionally. Not as a reward for passing his test, that would reduce her integrity to a transaction, which would dishonor the very thing he was celebrating, but as recognition of who she was, of the character she'd demonstrated. He would have to be careful about this. Direct, obvious gestures would embarrass her, might make her feel like her kindness was being bought. He needed to be subtle, thoughtful, creative. For the first time in years, Marcus Ashford felt something that had been missing from his life. Purpose beyond profit. Connection beyond calculation. Hope beyond the cynical equations that had governed his existence. One test had led to one answer. But that answer had opened up 1,000 new questions, the most important of which was, what kind of man did he want to be in response to what he'd learned? The morning sun streamed through the study windows, painting everything in shades of gold. In the kitchen, Amara hummed softly as she worked, unaware that her simple act of integrity had just changed everything. 3 days passed before Marcus found the courage to address what had happened that Thursday morning. 3 days during which he watched Amara work with new eyes, seeing things he'd missed before. The way she arranged fresh flowers in the vases each week, always choosing colors that complemented the seasons, autumn golds and deep reds now that November had arrived. The way she repaired small things without being asked, a loose button on a throw pillow, a picture frame hanging slightly crooked, a coffee stain on the marble counter that required special treatment she researched on her own time. The way she left small touches of warmth in a space that had been cold for so long. A cookbook open to a simple recipe for chicken soup left on the kitchen counter after Marcus had spent 3 days with a cold, working through it because he didn't know how to stop. Fresh batteries placed beside the TV remote when she noticed it was dying. His favorite coffee blend restocked before he'd even realized it was running low. These weren't in her job description. These were acts of care extended to someone she barely knew, by someone who had every reason to harbor resentment toward a man who had far more than she would ever have. Marcus found himself leaving his home office more often, manufacturing reasons to move through the penthouse while Amara was working. Not to supervise, he'd never felt the need before, but simply to be in the presence of someone who radiated a kind of grace he'd forgotten existed. On Sunday evening, he finally made his move. Amara was preparing to leave, gathering her few personal items from the closet by the door, when Marcus emerged from his study. "Ms. Johnson," he called out, his voice formal but not cold. "Do you have a moment?" She turned, surprise flickering across her face. In 3 months, he'd rarely initiated conversations beyond basic instructions or polite greetings. "Of course, Mr. Ashford. Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong. I'd like to discuss something with you in my study, if you don't mind." Amara followed him down the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. Marcus could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clasped together in front of her. She was nervous, probably wondering if this was about Thursday morning, if she'd somehow overstepped. When they entered the study, the stacks of cash were gone, replaced by the room's usual pristine order. Marcus gestured to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Please, sit." Amara sat, her posture perfect despite her obvious discomfort. Years of service work had taught her how to make herself small, unobtrusive, forgettable. Marcus took the chair beside her rather than sitting behind his desk, a deliberate choice to make this feel less like a boss-employee dynamic and more like a conversation between equals. "Thursday morning," he began, watching her face carefully. "When you found me in here." A flush crept up Amara's neck. "Sir, I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just wanted to make sure you were." "You didn't overstep," Marcus interrupted gently. "That's not why I'm bringing this up. I wanted to talk about what you did. Or rather, what you didn't do." The flush deepened. Amara's hands tightened in her lap. "Mr. Ashford, I would never." I know. Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying a weight that made her stop mid-sentence. That's the point, Ms. Johnson. I know that now. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I'm going to be honest with you, and I hope you'll forgive the manipulation involved. Thursday morning wasn't an accident. I wasn't actually passed out drunk. That was a test. Amara's eyes widened, then narrowed. He saw hurt flash across her face before she schooled it back to neutrality. A test, she repeated, her voice flat. Yes. A test of character. You were my 18th housekeeper in 5 years, Ms. Johnson. The previous 17 all stole from me in various ways. Small items at first, thinking I wouldn't notice, then growing bolder. Some sold stories about me to tabloids. One tried to blackmail me with fabricated allegations. Another brought her boyfriend into my home to case it for a burglary. Marcus stood and walked to the window, unable to meet her eyes as he continued. I'd become convinced that everyone had a price. That given enough opportunity and incentive, anyone would compromise their integrity. So I set up that scenario, $250,000 in cash, an apparently unconscious employer, no witnesses, cameras hidden where you'd never spot them. I wanted to see what you would do when you thought no one was watching. Behind him, Amara was silent. Marcus turned back to face her, forcing himself to confront the emotions playing across her face. Anger, hurt, disappointment, and something else he couldn't quite identify. That was wrong of me, he said quietly. To test you like that, to put you in that position. It was manipulative and unfair, and you have every right to be angry. I am angry, Amara said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Do you have any idea what it was like, standing in this room, looking at all that money? Knowing what it could mean for my family? My mother needs medical care that we can barely afford. My brother is working himself to exhaustion trying to get an education. And there it was, enough money to solve everything. Just sitting there. Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't take it because that's not who I am. That's not who my parents raised me to be. But it hurt, Mr. Ashford. It hurt to walk away from the solution to every problem I have. I know, Marcus said, and he meant it. I watched the footage, Ms. Johnson. I saw your face. I saw what it cost you to make that choice. You watched it. The anger in her voice sharpened. So you recorded me? Without my knowledge or consent? Yes. And I'm not going to insult you by claiming it was legal or ethical. It wasn't. But I needed to know. Know what? That poor people are honest. That we are not all thieves waiting for an opportunity? What exactly did you need to prove, Mr. Ashford? Marcus sat back down, running a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability that was completely unlike his usual controlled demeanor. I needed to know if I was right to have given up on people, he said quietly. I needed to know if my cynicism was justified or if I'd become so damaged by my experiences that I couldn't recognize goodness when it was right in front of me. He met her eyes. You answered that question, Ms. Johnson. You showed me that I was wrong. That integrity exists, even when it's costly. That there are still people in this world who will do the right thing simply because it's right, not because they'll be rewarded for it. Amara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. So what happens now? She asked finally. What happens now? Marcus repeated, standing slowly. He walked to his desk and pulled out an envelope he'd prepared earlier that day. Now, I ask for your forgiveness, and I try to make amends for what I did. He handed her the envelope. Amara took it reluctantly, her fingers barely touching the paper as if it might burn her. What is this? Open it. Inside was a single piece of paper, a letter on Ashford Global Industries letterhead. Amara's eyes scanned the words, then widened in shock. This says, "This can't be right." It's right, Marcus confirmed. Effective immediately, you're being offered a position as executive assistant to the CEO, me. The salary is $180,000 annually, with full benefits including premium health insurance that will cover your mother's medical needs completely. There's also a signing bonus of $50,000 and an education fund of $100,000 that can be used for any family member schooling. Amara's hand shook. Mr. Ashford, I don't understand. I'm a housekeeper. I don't have the qualifications for. You have the only qualification that matters, Marcus interrupted. Character. Everything else can be taught. I have a dozen assistants who know how to manage schedules and coordinate meetings. What I don't have is someone I can trust absolutely, someone whose integrity is beyond question. That's worth more than any degree or certification. Tears began streaming down Amara's face. This is too much. This is because I passed your test, but I shouldn't be rewarded for just being decent. This isn't a reward, Marcus said firmly. This is recognition. There's a difference. I'm not paying you for passing a test. I'm offering you an opportunity because I finally found someone worthy of my trust, and I've learned that trust is the most valuable commodity in the world. He paused, his own voice growing thick with emotion. My ex-wife once told me that I'd built an empire but lost my humanity in the process. She was right. I'd become so focused on protecting myself from being used that I'd forgotten what it meant to see people as people rather than potential threats or assets to be exploited. Marcus sat on the edge of his desk, his formal posture finally relaxing. Thursday morning, when you covered me with that blanket and counted my money to make sure it was safe, you didn't know I was watching. You didn't know there would be any benefit to your kindness. You did it anyway. That's who you are, Ms. Johnson. And that's who I want working beside me. Amara wiped her eyes, struggling to compose herself. I need time to think about this. It's a huge change, and I need to make sure I can actually do the job. I don't want to fail you. You won't, Marcus said with certainty. But yes, take time. Take as much as you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready. She stood, still clutching the envelope. Can I ask you something, Mr. Ashford? Anything. Why did you really do it? The test, I mean. What were you actually looking for? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. I was looking for proof that I was right to be cynical. That people are fundamentally selfish, that trust is foolish, that protecting yourself is the only rational response to the world. He smiled sadly. But I found something different. I found someone who reminded me of why I started building my company in the first place. Not to accumulate wealth, but to create something meaningful. To make a difference. And did I? Make a difference, I mean. You changed everything, Marcus said simply. 2 weeks later, Amara started her new position. The transition wasn't easy. She had to learn new software systems, corporate protocols, the intricate dance of high-level business negotiations. But Marcus was patient, and Amara was determined. More importantly, she brought something to the role that none of his previous assistants had possessed, the ability to see beyond the transactions to the human beings involved. She noticed when junior employees were being overworked and brought it to Marcus's attention. She remembered birthdays and personal milestones that Marcus had long stopped tracking. She treated everyone from the mailroom staff to board members with the same genuine respect, creating ripples of positive change throughout Ashford Global Industries. Marcus found himself changing too. He started leaving the office at reasonable hours. He called his daughter Emma more often, slowly rebuilding the relationship he'd neglected. He donated $10 million to establish a scholarship fund for students from low-income backgrounds, specifically targeting families like Amara's where talent and determination were limited only by resources. One evening, 6 months after that fateful Thursday morning, Marcus and Amara were working late in his office, preparing for a major board presentation. Amara had long since proven herself indispensable. Her organizational skills were exceptional, but more than that, she'd become his conscience, the voice that reminded him to consider the human cost of his business decisions. Can I ask you something? Amara said, looking up from her laptop. Of course. Do you ever regret it? The test, I mean. Looking back, knowing what you know now about me, do you wish you just trusted me from the beginning? Marcus considered the question carefully. Yes and no, he finally answered. I regret the manipulation, the lack of trust. That was a failure on my part, not yours. But I can't entirely regret what happened because it forced me to confront who I'd become. That moment when I watched you walk away from that money, it broke something inside me. Or maybe it fixed something that had been broken for a long time. He turned his chair to face her fully. I'd spent so many years building walls, protecting myself, assuming the worst about everyone. You didn't just pass a test, Amara. You held up a mirror and showed me what I'd lost: faith, hope, the ability to connect with other people authentically. That was the real test, and I was the one being examined. Amara smiled, the warm expression that had become familiar over the past months. For what it's worth, I think you passed. Did I? You recognized that you were wrong, you apologized, and you changed. That's not something a lot of powerful men are capable of doing. You could have just ignored what happened, or convinced yourself that I was the exception that proved your rule about human nature. Instead, you let it transform you. She closed her laptop and stood, gathering her things to leave. My mother wants to invite you to dinner next Sunday, by the way. She's been asking for months, and I keep making excuses because I know you're busy, but... I'd love to, Marcus interrupted. Tell her I'll be there. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, Amara said. That'll be enough. After she left, Marcus sat alone in his office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city glittered below him, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one a story he'd never know. For years, he'd looked at this view and seen only opportunities to exploit, markets to dominate, competitors to defeat. Now he saw something different. He saw people, struggling, striving, hoping, dreaming. People like Amara, whose integrity remained intact despite every reason to compromise it. People like her mother Grace, managing her diabetes with courage and dignity. People like her brother Jerome, who'd since enrolled full-time at a 4-year university thanks to the education fund, his dreams finally within reach. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Emma. Mom says I can stay with you next weekend if that's still okay. He smiled and typed back, more than okay. I can't wait. Love you. 3 words he'd typed more times in the past 6 months than in the previous 3 years combined. The test that Marcus had designed to expose human weakness had instead revealed human strength. It had shown him that character wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic heroism. It was about small choices made in quiet moments when no one was watching. It was about covering someone with a blanket, counting their money to keep it safe, writing a note to ease their mind when they woke. It was about being kind when kindness cost something. As Marcus prepared to leave the office, at 7 p.m., an hour that would have seemed impossibly early just months ago, he thought about the security footage he'd watched that Thursday morning. He'd eventually told Amara about the cameras and offered to delete the footage if she wanted. She'd surprised him by saying no. Keep it, she'd said. Not as evidence of my integrity, but as a reminder of yours. Remember the man who set up that test because he'd lost faith in people. Remember how much that isolation cost you. And remember the moment you chose to change. Marcus had kept the footage, had watched it a handful of times when he found himself slipping into old patterns of suspicion and cynicism. Each time, he saw Amara's hand reaching toward the money, hovering there in temptation, then pulling back. Each time, he remembered that integrity was real, that trust was possible, that human goodness existed even in a world that often seemed designed to destroy it. The test had been simple. Would Amara take money that wasn't hers? But the real test had been far more complex. Would Marcus have the courage to recognize goodness when he saw it? Would he have the humility to admit he'd been wrong? Would he have the wisdom to change? In the end, they'd both been tested. And in different ways, they'd both passed. As Marcus rode the elevator down to the parking garage, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. Not the brief satisfaction of closing a deal or the hollow pleasure of accumulating more wealth. Real happiness, rooted in connection, in purpose, in the knowledge that he was finally becoming the kind of person he could respect. All because a woman he'd tried to trap had shown him the way out of his own prison. The test was over. The transformation had just begun. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Ashford was grateful for both. In our darkest moments of cynicism, when we've convinced ourselves that goodness is a facade and trust is foolishness, sometimes all it takes is one person choosing integrity over opportunity to remind us of who we could be. The greatest tests in life aren't the ones we design for others. They're the ones life designs for us, forcing us to confront our own failures, our own brokenness, our own need for redemption. And sometimes, the people we test end up being the ones who save us. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more life-changing stories.